Well, good afternoon, or perhaps it's good morning or good evening, depending on what part of the world you're in today. We would like to welcome you to today's Journyx Project Execute webinar. The webinar that we're going to be presenting today is entitled Change is Coming, What Project Managers Should Know to Prepare Their Organizations. Such a true statement, and yet many of us just shudder when it comes time to realize that significant change is preparing to take place. So we have with us today Tim Rashelty. I'll let Tim give a bit of an introduction to himself, but Tim has a lot of experience in this area and has some good information to share with us today, as well as some practical applications of how to prepare an organization for change. We're going to keep our webinar today right at an hour. So we'll end right at the top of the hour. We recognize that your time is valuable, and so therefore we'll keep this right under the hour. I'll introduce myself. My name is James Bronner. I'm the Director of Marketing for Journyx, a company that's been around for about 15 years, and we're the sponsor for today's webinar. You'll learn a little bit more about us later on. A few housekeeping items. If you need to expand the screen for better viewing, there is a small icon in the bottom right-hand corner that's got a % associated with it. You can just click on that and increase the size of the screen. Shouldn't be a problem for today's presentation. And then you can receive a full PDU for attendance at today's live presentation. Your question would be, well, what do I need to do to receive that PDU? And the answer is absolutely nothing. We try to make it easy for you. So what we'll do is we'll send out a follow-up email, normally within 24 hours after the conclusion of the webinar. And in that email, we'll include Tim's contact information, as well as a link to the copy of the slides. He's also got some supporting material that he's going to include. And also we'll have a PDF of the PDU certificate for you, as well as information on how to submit to the Project Management Institute to record your PDU. So that's a real easy process. And Tim would like to encourage you to ask questions today during the presentation. The way you do that is simply by clicking on the Questions tab over on the GoToWebinar control panel. Type in your question and I'll collect those. If it makes sense to insert that question in the middle of the presentation, I'll do so. Otherwise, I'll save those questions to the end, and we'll run those questions by Tim so you can get some real live responses from our presenter today about how to manage change and prepare your organization for change. So our agenda is quite straightforward. First, Tim will be taking us through the webinar today on change, and then we'll begin responding to your submitted questions during the Q&A time. So without further ado, let me hand over the reins to Tim.
Great. Thanks, James. I appreciate it, and for the intro as well as the invite to present this webinar today. And it is kind of an interesting kind of title, if you will, and as James indicated, it is rather common when we think about some of the pressures that organizations find themselves dealing with these days, and the pressures are somewhat ubiquitous in terms of business sector. A lot of the change that public institutions, government-based institutions are dealing with are very similar to those that private institutions, product companies, technology companies, and even nonprofit organizations and universities are dealing with. And as we go through this webinar today, you should probably know that as a backdrop, this information came about from a lot of the work that I've been engaged with in various organizations, and specifically within state government in Oregon, the United States. And I'll talk a little bit more about that as we go through, but the information that we're going to be delving into about understanding change and how it interacts and should be incorporated with project management disciplines, and how do you create a readiness for organizations and change is all going to be case-based. And again, I'll explain that as we go through. As a backdrop as well for today, one of the things that we'll be dealing with in terms of, if I can get there we go, got my screen working. The objectives are pretty straightforward in that we've got a few different things we want to try to cover, but essentially it can all be boiled down to, I want to be able to share with you a tool that I've been using with organizations about how do you plan and bring about effective change within organizations. It doesn't matter if it's a large effort or a small effort. It doesn't matter if it's technology-driven or business process-driven. There's been tools that have been built within organizations that I've been associated with, and it's that tool that I want to share with you today. And in providing that tool, it'll be one of the handouts that James sends out via email after the presentation. Part of that is to understand kind of the dynamics of organizations. Part of that is understanding how the tool is used. We have to understand a little bit about the dynamics of organizations. And when we think about that, a lot of what the dynamics are about is how do we create a systems-level thinking organization, and how do we build that level of knowledge among the members of our project team and those that we work with on a regular basis, executive steering committees and other stakeholders within the organization and sometimes outside the organization. Once we understand the dynamics of the organization, we can start understanding the importance that project managers really serve as change agents for the organization. If we break organizations down, we typically have two parts of an organization. We've got operations, kind of daily operations, routine-based work, and then we've got ad hoc work, project-based work. The project-based work is really the work that is innovative. It's aimed at bringing about some level of change to the organization, moving an organization from a current state to a future state for whatever reason. It could be financial gain, market share gain, quality enhancements, risk mitigation, whatever that might be. So once we understand the dynamics, we start understanding a little bit of the skills that are necessary for project managers to be effective today and their teams. Then we can start delving into the difference between theory and practice. And we've spent a lot of time studying this in terms of the company that I work for right now and the companies that I've been brought in to engage this type of work in. And there's a lot written on organizational change, as you no doubt are very well aware. And I want to distill a lot of what is written down in terms of there's a lot of theory out there, and there's some theories that are highly valuable and highly practical, and there's a lot that aren't. So how do we sift through all that and make sense of what's really practical and really focus on that? And from that understanding of how do we build a practical model to bring about positive change, we then understand or have the basis to understand how we can put a comprehensive model or plan together to plan, lead, and sustain positive change within organizations. And that then leads us right into the tool, a Readiness for Change tool. And so James briefly introduced me, but just as a bit more of background, you know, you're here on this webinar. It's only fair that you understand who's speaking on the other line. And I'm a professor at George Fox University. I focus on human resource development and high-performance organizations in terms of the coursework that I take on, as well as international business, as well as transformational leadership and organizational change specifically. And in addition to that, I'm also an executive director at the Program Management Academy, where we engage in all sorts of organizations, nonprofit as well as for-profit. We help write curriculum for universities around organizational change management and project management, and we also engage in with organizations to help build tools, implement tools, and things of this nature. That kind of leads me to some of the work that I've done with the state of Oregon. I've been involved in state government now for about 10 years, and it was about 8 years ago that the executives that I was working with at the time were starting to realize that, you know what, we're not really effective when it comes to leading our organization through change. And, you know, we had a project office in place for a long time, and we still struggled with some of the project execution in terms of delivering things on time. And a lot of organizations have this problem, not just state government, not just the state of Oregon, but many, many organizations, depending on what you want to cite, what book or journal article or magazine article you want to cite. The large percentage of projects fail in some regard. They're either over budget, or they're not delivered in a timely fashion. They've lost scope by the time they actually do get delivered. There's something missing from the original intent, the original business case. And because of that, if we just kind of look at it very in a binary fashion. They either fail or they succeed in all of the aspects of the business case. The large majority of projects, especially change-based projects at an enterprise level, fail to deliver what they originally set out to accomplish. And so we started an investigation. We were charged to investigate, why is this so difficult? And so one of the first things that we did was we interviewed executives, and we interviewed the project office members in various different agencies. And we also started conducting a serious amount of research, just written about change within state government as well as government in general, as well as just business in general, to understand, are there unique aspects of business versus other types of changes? We realized that that answer was no. And so, but what we did in terms of starting this process, I want to start with you in the same way. When we think about change, or when you hear the word change within your organization, if you were to pull some executives together, or pull some project managers together, or project teams together, and just put the word change up on the screen, just like what we've got here, what comes to mind? What's the first thing that you think about regarding your organization and change? When we conducted this work, we interviewed dozens of individuals, and we boiled it down to 3 common themes that came about within our organizations on a regular basis. And the first and foremost was, it's really hard. We're not very good at it, and in addition to it being hard, we also realize that it's absolutely necessary. Our environment is not static, and therefore change is a reality. We have to constantly change for competitive, to stay competitive, to introduce new products, provide new services, these types of things. So we recognize it's hard. We recognize that it's necessary, and because of its nature of being hard, it's not usually successful. And again, as we look into the research, pull whatever stats you want to, roughly 80%. Many cases you'll see it more, maybe a little bit less from some authors. Change fails. And when we conducted our research within Oregon, a lot of the individuals in agencies that we spoke with, it was upwards of 90%. When we went back and conducted some retrospectives and did some audits on some big projects that were actually taking place over the last decade of time, nearly 90% of the efforts were failing in some regard or another. And so we got even further charged by the executive team to figure this out, because one of the things that's happening probably within your governments as well, we are constantly challenged by not only budgets, but changing demands by our constituents, as well as varying expectations depending on stakeholders. Rather common, whether you're in state government, federal government, private sector, any type of business, these are regular common occurrences. And so we were charged with figuring out, well, why is this the case? And one of the reasons that we figured this out within Oregon State Government was we didn't understand the system nature of the changes that we were actually delving into. And I'll give you an example of the majority of the projects that we interviewed, the project managers and teams, and the projects that we audited. The missing component was the lack of systems thinking. The projects, let's just take for an example, let's update a Medicaid system, technology system, or another case would be let's update and enhance a procurement system, and a technology procurement system for all of state government. What we found out was that the project managers were highly skilled individuals at managing projects, especially technology projects. And a lot of the individuals, the project managers and lead project team, were from the technology side. And what we found was that although most of the teams were identifying major aspects of change beyond the technology, the primary focus of the project was only technology. And so it started our investigation into, well, what are the dynamics of change? When we think about the way an organization works, if we were just to, not blueprint how things are done, but if we were to whiteboard what should be done and what should be considered when we think about all things project related, what should those things be? From this discussion, from this brainstorm, from this research and investigation, we came up with a series of lists, if you will, of different things. Not only does the technology need to change, but because there's new technology, there's likely skills that need to be developed. So therefore, there's training that needs to happen, and there's a communication that needs to take place. Some things overlapped very directly with project management areas of focus. Some things were clearly outside. What we did with this laundry list of ideas is we grouped them into 6 main categories. And the 6 main categories we then flow charted. We built a causal diagram in terms of what impacts what. And that's here on the next slide. And what we identified was everything really boiled down to what are the people doing and how well are they doing it. So it really all boiled down to people and performance. And when we look at this document, a lot of times when we got involved with the executives, they had mentioned that, well, we really want to change our culture. Well, the culture is changed, and it's manifest by the way in which work gets done. And if you look at this diagram, technology is part of the people category. So it's connected with people. And it's right here. If you can see my cursor on the screen, it's about the 2 o'clock hour here within this people circle. So all these things are connected to people. Technology, if this is the only area of focus that our project managers were focused on, and in some projects, as we found out, that's what they were focused on, they lost sight of a lot of what we've categorized as organizational arrangements. These are the structure of the company, the strategy of the organization or the division, the processes, the practices, maybe the policies or the rules, the laws perhaps. All of that's organizational arrangement stuff. That's how that got cataloged by the individuals that we were researching and the projects that they were on. And so therefore, the technology project is only one portion of the overall change effort. And it seems obvious, right? I mean, many of us who have worked on projects like this before, we know that technology is but a component. But the individuals that we worked with recognized that, you know what, my sole focus is getting this technology system up and running. And the business, those people over there outside of the project team, they need to worry about their performance. And the business needs to worry about, well, whatever process changes need to happen because I'm implementing a piece of technology, and therefore some of your processes need to change, your practices need to change, your communication might change, your reward structure might change. All of that is you guys, not us. You know, it's you, the business, not us, the technologist and the project team. So we realized that one of the reasons we struggled with projects was because we focused too much on one aspect. Technology, in many cases, became the area of focus beyond anything else that's on this diagram. So what we did, again, we boiled this down into 6 categories. The organizational culture is what is created from the way in which all this work gets done. We recognize that we're influenced by our external environment, but we only know what's going on out there if we constantly diagnose that. And we only know what's going on inside if we constantly diagnose our performance. And it's from those two, the trends in the market, maybe the trends in technology advancements and the opportunities in the market, as well as the way in which we internally perform our current work efforts. That's what creates a level of change. And the change certainly could be technology driven, but we need to also recognize that as we make changes and plan for this new technology, we use this slide right now as a facilitation tool. It's a one-page document, as you can see right here. It is a facilitation tool that project managers and project teams now use to walk around to say, what are our performance goals? And we've got obvious performance goals for the project team, such as being on time with our milestones and deliverables, as well as within scope and budget, these kind of things. But we also have to understand it's all about the business. And so what are the business goals? What are the business expectations, the business outcomes relative to this change that we're taking on? So this tool gets used by project managers, project teams, and business owners to say, all right, if the new piece of technology is going to be rolled out, what new skills do we need? What new abilities do we need? What new individuals and group and team activities need to occur? Do we need to change job descriptions? These kind of things. So it almost is creating a dialogue, which for the project managers on the phone and the project team leaders on the phone, that there's probably nothing more valuable to effective projects than having open and honest communication. And not just communication in terms of, hey, I got that status report done, but communication in terms of real dialogue that takes place between the project team and the business owners of whoever's going to be operationalizing the project outcome once it's finished. So I had mentioned earlier that there's a lot written about change management, project management, and things of this nature, and there certainly are. One thing that we never did find in our research was an illustration like this that explained this is one way to kind of view the culture of the organization and how it's manifest by the way in which we go about our work. So if we're looking for ways to change, we should be looking at the external environment, our internal performance, and identifying what within organizational arrangements and or people is going to be impacted and needs to be changed. So we found this tool, and it's been quite valuable for the way in which we manage our projects. Some of the other things that we found as we conducted our internal investigation within state government, the individuals that we interviewed and researched as part of our case studies, as we did that, we were conducting at the same time a lot of investigation into what was already written. Academic journals, as well as practitioner journals, as well as just web-based searches and case studies that other consulting organizations, as well as public organizations, research firms, think tanks have written. So we went through and started looking at, what of everything that's been written, what is really important, and what theories that are out there are valid and that we should take into account as we start thinking about how do we drive down the amount of failure we have from 90% to something a lot better, because again, we're pressured by budgets, we're pressured by time, and anytime we've got a $100 million project, if we go $20 million over budget or 20% over budget, that obviously has a significant amount of implication relative to other opportunities we could be taking on. So the more on-time deliveries we have, the more things that we can actually do, the more offerings of service and products we can provide to our customers. So as we started our research in this regard, obviously we found a tremendous amount written on organizational change and managing change already. A lot of it all boiled down to the gentleman, Kurt Lewin, who wrote about, in order to bring about a level of change, you have to unfreeze the current situation. You've got to change it and then refreeze it. The challenge that we have these days is that there's no refreezing of things. There's constant change. So you need to be able to stop for a certain period of time so that you can operationalize something, but part of that operation has to be continuous process improvement, which means continuous change. So although it all boils back down to Kurt Lewin and these three phases of work, unfreeze, change, and refreeze, we recognize that there's value there in understanding the phases of effort, but there's certain things that have changed since he started writing about this back in the 1940s. And so we took that under advisement relative to the importance of what he had, but also recognized that it had some limitations as well. Another individual that we found that was quite helpful was that when it comes to change management, it's not as scientific as project management, and I even use scientific relative to project management loosely because project management, I have a personal bias that there's much more art in project management than there is science. But at least with project management, you can identify your deliverables and you can kind of, dial in the resources that you need, whether it's money or personnel, to make sure that you get certain deliverables accomplished on time. But when it comes to change and the reality of change, Elisabeth KublerRoss wrote a book called On Death and Dying, and the application of what she had in that book, this cycle that individuals go through when they endure some level of personal change, usually personal loss. There's these 5 stages that people go through: denial, anger, bargaining, and depression before you start accepting a new way of things. Elisabeth KublerRoss's application here, the processes that individuals go through, have been adopted by many who write about organizational change to say these are the same phases that people will go through in an organization relative to change within that company. And so if we're getting a new piece of technology, if I am 2 years from retiring, I may not be gung-ho about trying to learn a new technology system. So I might deny or be in denial about that change for some time, and I might be angry for some period of time, And at the same time, one of the individuals sitting right next to me might be gung-ho about the new technology, saying, wow, it's about time we got new technology. We should have had this 5 years ago. They might go through denial and anger and bargaining and depression quite quickly and be immediately at the acceptance phase. The art and science of project management, you can't necessarily apply the same rules when it comes to individual change, which again, if we think back to the prior slide, that causal illustration, that model, it's the individuals that create the performance of the organization, and there's a level of importance, as we can well imagine, that the individuals need to be ready and accepting of the change. Otherwise, performance is going to fail or get worse than what it is in the current state. So this became an important model as we started thinking about our readiness for change, readiness for the Project Go Live tool that we were building. Another illustration or document that we found was from Alan Weber in our research. And if you've studied anything from Alan Weber, he was the co-founder of Fast Company magazine, and over his professional career, he would keep just random, not so much random thoughts, but lessons learned as he worked through his career, and he documented them into rules of thumb. And one of them was relative to organizational change, and he came up with this formula. And the formula has been written in different ways, and it's illustrated on your screen there in some of the different ways that it's been documented. But Alan Weber says that the formula for change is that D times V times F has to be greater than R. And what this means is that D is the dissatisfaction with how things are now. There needs to be a dissatisfaction with how things are now, and when that is multiplied by the possibility, the vision of the future, the vision of what is possible. So when dissatisfaction of how things are now is multiplied by the vision of what is possible and multiplied by some of the first steps that are taking toward that vision, when those three things multiplied together, when they are greater than R, the resistance that the organization, and therefore really the individuals within the organization, has for that future, change will occur. And so as we worked with our execs at the agencies, a lot of them were, they recognized the importance of change management. They recognized the complexity, but they were also hungry for, what's the way through this? There's got to be a formula for this. Well, by and large, there is a formula. This is it. Whether you use Alan Weber's formula or some of the others by Beckhart and Harris as noted here, or there are some others as well, really what it is that the need for the future has to be more attractive than the present state. And if it's not, then there's going to be resistance. And quite frankly, even if it is, because people have differing perceptions, again, if I'm ready to retire versus early in my career, I might be more or less willing to take on a certain amount of change and the effort that goes along with that change. So the individual readiness for change becomes important, because unlike a Gantt chart that we can run as a project manager to say, by this date, this milestone is going to be done, and again, we can dial in or dial back the resources needed to make that happen. Readiness is slightly different. We can't say Thursday of next week, resistance will end. It's just not going to happen. We can understand this. Rationally, we can understand this as project managers. And so we wanted to build in a formula like this, but again, understand that there's not a formula that's going to be able to be put into a Gantt chart that says by this date all resistance will end, and therefore we will be in smooth sailing territory here on out for this change. So this became an important component in some of the research. Another important component was, as we investigated, continued to investigate, why do we have 90% failure in some of the things we do? We started recognizing and contacting other state agencies outside of Oregon, as well as private industries, and project managers and execs, and we started expanding our research a little bit, and came to find out that a lot of times organization projects fail is because there's a lack of change management oversight or integration. And so we further realized that not only were we suffering from this challenge, but there is a consistency across many organizations that when there's a project failure, if there's an investigation as to why, it often becomes, well, the business wasn't ready. And again, this gets back to us versus them, right? The project team says we're ready, well, the business says they're not ready. So they try to push through some kind of project, a technology project or otherwise, and there's just not a readiness. And part of that is because of a lack of organizational change management. And so we started figuring out we need to build a model based on all that we've been researching from the individuals in the industry as well as what's already been written about this. We needed to build a model that we could actually use, a practical model that we could provide to our project managers so that they could integrate it into their knowledge and their abilities as project managers. So we wanted to leverage what we already knew and understood the importance of, that being project management skill, and integrate change management application in addition to what they already know about project management. So the way that we did that is we started similar to Kurt Lewin. We started at a very high level. What are the 3 phases of work and change that we're going to take on? 3 phases: current state, future state, and then in the middle of those 2 is the transition. How are we actually going to change? We can think of it in terms of strategic planning, in terms of how do we assess the need for some change, how do we envision the future of the organization or what the possibilities are, and then what do we think about or how do we actually engage in that transition. And we deciphered this into a couple different perspectives. First of all, the whole thing here is the way in which organizational change management strategy is managed. So everything from the left side to the far right side, everything from current state all the way through the future state, that's all about the strategy. Right in the middle, the transition component, is the business transition management. And that's where the project management stuff resides, the discipline of project management. Illustrating it this way gave us an understanding that, well, to understand the need and to understand the vision, that needs to be owned by the business, the operations of the organization. And then we need to matrix in for the transition component only, the project management activities. And once we had this in place, this was kind of step 1. How do we build the high-level phases of work so that we can not create us and them, project teams and business teams, but how do we integrate it together to say it's all about the business, and we all need to focus on both the need to change as well as the vision, but at the same time, we need to rely on the project managers to help bridge the gap between the 2. And bridging the gap is not meant to just focus on the technology or just focus on the process, but again, back to that causal diagram, it's the whole thing. How do we focus on the driver of the change? It could be process or technology, but how do we use that diagram to facilitate what all needs to be modified or changed? Once we understood this, we then broke down just a standard stage gate or phased gate project management set of protocols on top of this. So we have 6 phases. Project Management Institute has something slightly different than this, but we pull a lot of our material from PMI. And there's a very good reason that we break out initiating into 2 different phases, pre-initiating and initiating. And it's all about the business case. One of the things we realized in our research is we like to get things started. We like to jump right into planning and executing without making sure that we spend time to truly understand the business case and the value of the business case, to truly document what is needed and truly document performance expectations and truly document the measures and metrics by which we're going to measure our success. So we clearly delineate that in the pre-initiating work effort, there's a validation of need and this type of work that's being done. But the real big deliverable is the business case. For initiating, the real big deliverable, in addition to making sure that we've got resources, team structure, and things like this, the big deliverable is a strategy. What is the strategy for the business to maintain its operation as well as bring about this level of change? Because if your organizations are like the ones that I work in, a big question often comes down to, well, how am I possibly going to provide all those resources? They're all busy right now working on the day-to-day operation of things. How do we carve out 6 people or 26 people or 106 people to work on a major change effort if I'm just barely trying to keep things running with the staff that I have now? So we need to have a clear strategy for both the project as well as the day-to-day operations. And then planning, how do we integrate a project plan of core work plans and facilitation plans? We can think of this as core work plans in terms of technology plans, networking plans, comm plans, things like this. Facilitation plans include things like the readiness assessment that we're about ready to get into. Executing, pretty standard with PMI. We implement the initiative, and here we're monitoring and controlling that process as well. We close out using retrospectives as well as lesson learned type activities. And then we move into operations. And operations is all about how do we operationalize the change, integrate that into our day-to-day way of life, and make sure that we are focused on the performance measures that tie all the way back to the business plan. So again, it's the reason that we broke the business case out. We need to be focused on the business case. The performance here flows all the way back to the business case. An important component of all of this is communication, and within each one of these phases, communication obviously becomes important. And one of the things that we're going to focus the rest of the webinar on is the readiness assessment. So the readiness for change is a gradual slope, and depending on the resolution on your monitor, you should be able to see at the bottom of your screen here, not only do we have a foundation of communication across all of this work activity, but there should be an increasing readiness for change the closer we get to operationalizing the project, the new way of doing things, the new way for our business. And so we wouldn't expect to have the same level of readiness at pre-initiating and initiating as we would as we're getting closer to closing or at the end of executing. So the slope becomes important because one of the key ingredients that we did not find in the research that we desperately needed to have is that the readiness for change assessment needs to change. It needs to change based on the phase of work that you're in, based on your project. There are a lot of ready-to-use readiness assessments that you can just use Google or some kind of search engine to say readiness for change assessment or implementation assessment, things like this, and they give you a set of questions. But the reality is, what we found is that we have not found a tool that that's scalable based on project, and also kind of gradient in terms of what gets asked at pre-initiating should be different than what gets asked at executing. And so we went about building our own tool relative to the lack of that tool in the literature and based on what we had found from those that we were researching and interviewing for this case. So this is the readiness assessment. The reason we call it a readiness assessment is because READI stand for certain aspects of the readiness plan. So readiness stands for how do we look at our resources, education and training, awareness and communication, the dynamics of the organization, and the implementation plan. And so the resources, primarily what we're looking at here is, do we have the physical, financial, and personnel resources necessary for the scope of the project, and do those resources, especially the personnel, do they have the capacity and the skills to plan, lead, and sustain the change that we're after? And again, what we would be asking during each phase of work, and I'll come back to the phases of work in just a second, because what we would ask during the pre-initiating phase is we're working on the business case, or the initiating phase is we're working on the strategy. Those resources are going to be very different than the types of resources that we need for time of executing. So the resources become important. So it's a critical aspect of readiness for change. Education and training is another important aspect, and this is really about breadth, depth, and kind of the state or the current condition. And by that, what we're meaning is, do we have a plan in place? Again, if we're in the initiating or planning phase, we're going to be wanting to know, do we have a plan in place? If we're 60 days before go-live of a major system replacement, we want to know if education and training is happening, and not just whether or not the training is occurring. Well, yeah, last Tuesday we had this training class, but more importantly, are the people that need to be doing something different, are they learning what they need to know? So not just did they go to a class, but did they actually learn, and do they now have the skill and ability to apply that? The next phase of the readiness is about awareness. How do we bring about a level of awareness for the change that needs to happen? And not just awareness, but how do we enhance and create some kind of open communication, a dialogue, if you will, so that we can reach a level of consensus, if at all possible, about the vision that we're trying to accomplish, the future state that we're trying to realize. So awareness and communication. It's about understanding, building some level of consensus, and understanding the vision, being aware of the vision, and understanding how they can participate in reaching that vision. The dynamics of organization, that's that causal diagram that we were illustrating a little bit earlier. Do we understand that the impact of technology, do we understand the impact that's going to have on the structure of the organization or the processes or practices of the organization, and do we have plans in place to address that? And so part of the dynamics of the organization get to what is our culture and what tools do we have in place to understand the system of changes that are going to happen. And in this case, history becomes important. If we have a history of failing, the most near future is likely going to be very close to what our history has been like, unless there's been a serious amount of intervention and change already take place. So the history becomes important because we have to understand what's been done in the past, because that's what people are going to hold on to. And so we look at the history in terms of what has happened historically, what might we need to be doing differently, what might we need to create in terms of intervention to bring about a different level of change. And then the implementation plan. There certainly needs to be an implementation plan, especially getting ready to go live, and that's about the framework and the focus of what needs to be done. What switches need to be switched? What changes do we need to make sure are already in place? Do we have a technology team in place if there's new technology like help desk and these type of things? Do we have certain things in place associated with our implementation plan? Do we have a cutover plan? Do we have, if we have errors or issues, what's the process of communication? What's the process of resolution of those once we go live and leading up to go live? So we'll talk a little bit more about these over the next 5 minutes, and we'll leave a little bit of time for some question and answer here at the end as well. The reason that this becomes important, and I've got a few slides here that we'll go through quickly, if all of this is in place, we have found from working at the state of Oregon and working with other organizations, if these are in place, your probability for success, probability for positive change goes up. If you don't have the resources available, it's simply going to serve to frustrate those that are trying to bring about some level of change. If you don't have the education and training, you have the ability to change, but you're probably going to be learning while you're failing with whatever you're trying to bring about. And so it's going to be frustrating for those that are involved, probably stressful as well. And if you don't have an open dialogue, open communication, again, change can certainly come about, but you're likely going to have us versus them mentality and not a we type mentality. No communication usually leads to feeling as if change has been imposed upon us, and that leads to frustration as well as confusion. And without an understanding of the systems thinking, this also will lead to us versus them mentality, the business folks versus the project team, or the business folks versus the technology team, and certainly that's going to be frustrating as well as stressful. And if you don't have an implementation plan, most of the time you're going to create fits and starts regarding any type of change or project that you're trying to bring about. So if you've got all 5 of these as part of your readiness plan, the probability of success goes up. And the probability of success, it has to be managed in the natural life cycle of the projects. We're probably familiar with the traditional project management life cycle, which is illustrated here, and I've got highlighted the planning focus, because during the planning focus is when we need to be planning for how do we administer a readiness for change. And the way in which we administer readiness becomes important because, again, what we would be measuring at the very beginning is very different than what we would measure at the end. What we've done within the state of Oregon is we've identified through our phases of work, we want to conduct, especially on the major projects, anything over $5 million, especially on the major projects, we want to make sure that at least during pre-initiating, we get the business executives and whoever the sponsors are of the project to conduct a readiness assessment. And this is just a one-page document. It's very simple. again, it goes through the resources, education and training, awareness and communication, dynamics of organizational change, and the implementation strategy. And for the most part, there's only a couple questions, or actually there's statements in many cases for each one of these 5 areas. So for instance, resource management, the first question is, does the organization have the capacity as well as other resources necessary to plan, lead, and sustain the change? It's either yes or no. We try to keep it binary. We don't want some Likert scale of, is it 1 through 5 or whatever. It's just yes or no, very binary. The reason for this is because it creates a dialogue. I've never had a team of executives answer the first pre-initiating readiness assessment unanimous across the board. And that's good, because part of what the assessment here is for is to create a dialogue. The perception that one person has is going to be different than the perception someone else has, so it creates a dialogue of conversation that can take place so that you can be better prepared going from pre-initiating into initiating. And so what's illustrated here by the diamonds is that as we're trying to increase the readiness of change from pre-initiating all the way through executing and closing and onto operations, we want to be able to create a baseline of measures at pre-initiating. Where are we in terms of what we think we're ready for? Once we start initiating, we start building the strategy, we want to conduct this assessment again. Once we get into planning, we might conduct it again. And once we get into executing, we want to conduct it, and we recommend conducting it at least 4 times. And we say this, again, it needs to be scalable based on the duration of your project. If you've got a project that's going to run for 4 months, there's no reason necessarily to do it 4 times. But most of our projects over $5 million are going to run for at least a year, most of the time 2 or 3 to 5 years perhaps, depending on the project. Now, what we want to be able to do is, in executing, shortly after the kickoff, we want to have at least 1, if not 2 or 3 assessments conducted, readiness assessments conducted, because we want to be able to see the increase, the migration of individuals up that readiness scale for the change to take place. The results we get actually allow us to modify some of the plans that we have in place. So as we start working through this readiness assessment, we can modify our core work plans and facilitation plans based on the results we get from the readiness assessment. And by working the readiness assessment, not only will we understand, are we ready to go live with the technology, but also are we ready to go live with the individuals and the process changes and functional changes and other types of changes that might need to happen. Now, just to illustrate, this is just it might be a little bit hard to understand, but the numbers here relative to the phases of work are the numbers of questions or statements or otherwise items in the assessment. So in the pre-initiating assessment, there's only 2 resource items. There's 3 education and training items. There's 3 awareness and communication items, 6 relative to dynamics of the organization, and 2 for implementation planning. And as you can see, as you go toward executing, those numbers change. And as James indicated at the top of the hour when we started the webinar, we'll send you the tool that we have, because we want to make it available to you, and feel free to use it if you think it's valuable. And you can see at the executing side of the equation here, the executing phase of work, as we've got it broken down into 2 areas. One is 2 or 3 times just after kickoff. So again, you might have kickoff. Next month you might conduct a readiness assessment. Maybe a month or 2 later you conduct another one, just to see if your interventions and some of the aspects you have in your project plan are building greater level of awareness, if your resources are holding up to the demands of your project as well as the demands of the operational work efforts, if you're creating greater levels of awareness and communication and dialogue based on those that are going to be impacted by this change, and if you're taking into account the dynamics of the organization, and if you're refining your implementation strategy to move forward. And as you can see, that's on the kind of after the kickoff, we'd have 2 or 3 assessments. And then before you'd go live, the assessments are going to change drastically at this point. The assessment at this point, it's still yes or no. You just say it's either in place or it's not in place. But then we've added a column in our readiness assessment to say, do we actually need to have this in place for go live? So let's say that we've got 100 people that need to be trained and knowledgeable about a new system. If the question is, has everyone been trained, and do they have the skill and ability and knowledge to execute a new system? If the answer is no, but it's answered no because only 90 out of the 100 people feel as if they're competent enough to manage in the new system, you'd likely not go live. You would likely not go live in that situation. You'd probably still go live, but you'd have mitigation plans in place, more training perhaps, or something of this nature. The items there for short of go live, so 2 or 3 times leading up to go live is what that column's saying. For the resources alone, you can see that we've got 17 questions about people, and we've got 3 specific questions about the portfolio of projects and operational aspects of resources. And that's the way in which that's broken down. So when you get the tool and you see that, if you wanted to refer back to this slide 34, that's what this is referring to. And so that's just the number of items we have and the way in which we modify the readiness assessment when we go from one phase to the next phase. And this is an illustration of the report out. It's just a template that we've used at Human Services, where after we've conducted an assessment, we would use this to fill in some of the information. This is what was accomplished. These are some of the results that we got and some planned activities that we need to have relative to resources, education, training, awareness, communication, dynamics of the organization, and our implementation plan. We can also document on here just a brief summary about what we found, as well as some top risks and issues that we're finding based on this result. So we can conduct the elaborate readiness assessment, distill the results down into a one-page summary, which is especially handy for the executives of big projects, and we can have not only the results but also our action plans side by side relative to each of the 5 main areas for building readiness to change. We've found that this has helped us a great deal, this readiness tool, as well as just the research that's gone into understanding project work as well as organizational change management work and integrating the 2 things together along a continuum such as this. And in doing so, we've been able to build greater levels of readiness for change as we've gone about our project work. And I don't have a specific percentage as of right now regarding, well, how far have we driven our project success up, or otherwise our project failures down from 90% into a different number. I don't have an actual percentage of the types of projects that we've taken on over the last few years, but this has been incorporated and used, and qualitatively I can tell you that there have been much better results, especially in terms of a sense of inclusion and engagement among some of the larger projects that we've actually taken on over the last few years. So it's been quite valuable for us. And if you've got questions, I'd be happy to take any questions either online here, or if you've got follow-up questions, you can certainly send me an email after this webinar. But at this point, I think I'll conclude my commentary and hand it back over to James to wrap things up and to send us on for the rest of our day. James?
Boy, thanks, Tim. That I tell you, just by listening, I feel more ready for implementing change. That's a lot of great information. I know that our audience has been piqued because all of us have been through that process of facing what seems just that insurmountable wall of change and trying to scale that. And I think you've done a great job, Tim, of showing how to set up and prepare for change. Well, we're going to go ahead and open up our time for Q&A. We've got about 5 minutes remaining, and we want to utilize that time so that we can get everyone back to work at the top of the hour. So if you've not done so already, I would encourage you to click on the Questions tab and type in your question, and we'll get to as many of these as we can here in our remaining time, Tim. So let's jump right on in. Our first question comes in from Danielle. She says, Tim, you talked about the readiness assessment being a valuable tool for helping folks to implement and drive projects to success. Do you have some examples of where that readiness assessment has caused folks to put the brakes on and done just the reverse?
Yeah, actually, that's a good question from Danielle. You know, I do know of one project. It was a major child care system reorganization, which had it impacted everything to the mission and vision of this organization. That had about 350 people in this one department, and I know that from their use of this readiness tool, especially going up to go live, they postponed their go live twice, which pushed them out about 4 months. But as part of their lessons learned and retrospective at the end of that, they found more value in postponing than have tried to push that through to the original go live date. And the reason that they postponed it was because of the results that came back from their user community and stakeholder community, having filled out the readiness assessment, especially the implementation. The execution phase readiness assessment that they had in place. They found out from that some of their testing was not fully tested in terms of the stress tests. Some of the individuals that needed to be trained were not, they had been trained, but they didn't feel competent enough. They didn't feel comfortable enough with the solution to go live. And so the value that they had was that, one, the users of the system, the employees, they felt listened to, because in fact they were listened to. They said, hey, wait, we're not quite comfortable. We'd love to have an additional month. Part of that additional month, they found some problems with the stress testing, so while they got the folks trained up and better prepared, they also had an additional time to do some more stress testing of the system, of which illuminated some other errors that they weren't otherwise prepared for. So that's one example, just by using and having the discipline of this tool. As project managers, we know that, you know, if you're running a little bit behind your schedule, some of the things that first get cut are, well, let's cut down training, let's cut down perhaps some of the testing just so that we can meet our launch date. If they would have done that, their history, their culture would have continued to be this kind of focus of, well, no one's really listening to me as an end user, my voice doesn't matter, these kind of things, and they found a different a different outcome that was much more valuable than trying to hit their original go-live date.
That's a good case study, Tim. Thanks for that. Something about that communication that takes place that solves a myriad of problems, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Let's continue on. We've got about 2 minutes left and some additional questions coming through. I'll just make a mention that we're going to close down the session at the top of the hour because I know everybody's got to get back to work. But what I'll do is I'll leave it open for an extra couple of minutes, and you can go ahead and submit your questions electronically, and we'll get responses back to you after the session. So here's one that comes in, Tim, from Sue. Sue says, or Susan, I'm sorry. It says, you know, our organization doesn't have a high level of maturity as far as the PMMI maturity model. We're fairly low. This seems to be kind of focused on companies that have kind of a more mature project management methodology. How would you suggest that we implement it on the kind of the lower end of the maturity model scale?
Yeah, that's a good question as well. I'm going to, while I answer that question, I'm going to slide back into the slides here a little bit. You know, the individuals that we interviewed came from a lot of different organizations with a lot of different maturity, and you know, it was recognized that those that have a higher level of maturity when it comes to PM have an easier way to integrate new things such as change management processes, protocols, OD-type protocols within their project schedule, within their project discipline, their project phases. But I came back to this slide for a couple reasons. One, regardless where you are on that maturity scale, this document from NASCIO, it's the National Association of State CIOs, this short book, it's more like a journal article than anything, but it's called Discipline Succeeds, and this pamphlet helped us out quite a bit, because for those organizations, regardless where they were on the maturity curve of their PMO or project discipline, this helped prepare not only project managers, but the executives of agencies and divisions. And a lot of times when it comes to project management, the project manager has to kind of lead up and explain, you know, why are we taking so long on this phase of work or that phase of work or that deliverable, and they're educating their senior leaders as well as their project teams in some cases. This document is really easy to read, very well written, and explains the value of having a disciplined approach such as project management. as you start doing that, one of the things that we needed to do with our teams that we researched, we started to break down what is the common denominator of disciplined projects. It's one of the reasons we built illustrations such as this slide right here. How do you start with big phases of work, current state to future state through transition state? What do we need to have in terms of pre-initiating, initiating? Not every one of our agencies follows all 6 of these categories. Some agencies only have 4 main phases of work, but they've got the key aspects: business case, strategy, integrated project plan. So I would say if you know that you're not very mature, or if you know that you are mature as an organization with project management, you have to figure out what is the integration between the discipline of project management and organizational change management to the cultural readiness of your company. And what we've got displayed here may not be kind of, okay, it's out of the can, we can start implementing this right away. There needs to be a cultural aspect that, hey, this will quote-unquote fit within the way in which we go about our work. So if you're low on the maturity curve, I would say take some baby steps. Figure out, how do we do the business case first, and then maybe some other things. And so this Discipline Succeeds article can help out.
Great. Thanks, Tim. Well, we've reached the top of the hour, and I promised to have you back working productively, so we'll have to hold to that promise. Our timeline is critical at this point. Tim, I would like to say a great big thank you to you. It's been a fantastic presentation, lots of pertinent information. I want to remind you that in our follow-up email that we'll send up to the live attendees, we're going to include not only a link to the slides, but also to the readiness document that Tim referred to there, that you can actually go through the checklist. That looks like a valuable tool. It certainly is going to be a valuable tool in my arsenal as a project manager. What does Journyx do? In fact, as I was listening to Tim's presentation, it became obvious that the area that we really focus on as a company is the resource piece. Our solution is called Journyx Project Execute, and we solve the problem of figuring out who's working on what, when will they be finished, who's available for the next project, what are their skill sets. It's a big problem in a lot of organizations because usually they have multiple systems. They have folks that are doing the 3-day, 3-person project that's not documented anywhere. They've got time off over in an HR system. So what we do is try to help you to get that global picture of all your folks. What are they doing? What are they working on? When will they be finished? So if that's an issue you're dealing with, feel free to give us a holler. Got our contact info there on the screen. I'd also encourage you to continue to grow in your project management maturity by attending webinars like you've done today. You'll be receiving a full PDU for those of you that are attending live, and there are some other webinars in our series this semester as well on change management, on setting up a PMO in an organization, one on scope and requirement management for projects. So I would encourage you to visit our website. In the upper left-hand corner it says register for webinar. Feel free to do so. Not only garner some additional PDUs for your certification, but also to give you some additional experience in the area of project management from folks who have, in the case of Tim, many, many years of experience, and some others, 20, 30 years. I've got one gentleman that's got over 35 years of experience in project management. So it's a great opportunity to learn from some folks who've been there and really cut their teeth on some successes and failures in project management. Again, we want to thank you for taking time out of your busy schedules to join us today, and we hope that all your projects are successful and that you're able to circumvent that chasm of change that faces all of us. Have a wonderful day today. Thanks again for your attendance.